Initially, I was interested in wanting to write the stories of mothers who had managed to get to high places in the sector and had managed the system. Those people, they've survived generally because of household staff. Of course, there's other parts to it as well, but that's a big chunk of the answer. You have mothers who've left their kids in another country to work in a conflict zone in a different country. That's also one way of managing, right? You manage having kids by not seeing them. You leave them with your extended family and you go and work elsewhere. So that's one way of surviving, but is that really what we want?
This is our Pandora's Box, a podcast where we stare down the worst of what you're dealing with right now with curiosity to find out what you can do to create a life that rings true to who you really are. Led by me, Merit Eliades, your elder millennial sister. And this week, we take on both having a family and a meaningful career. This isn't an episode to convince you whether to have children or not. And in fact, as someone who was always on the fence about having kids and who ultimately decided at 35 that I didn't want them, actually, I should say, who realized she didn't want them, I'm not the person to give you advice on whether you should have kids or not. But that being said, I still think it's really important to know for yourself whether or not you want children and to hear from others who have done so in challenging environments. Because I think right now we can all agree it is a very challenging time to have a kid in the United States. So to do that in a way that I think will be helpful and not fearful, I brought in a guest who has managed to have children while continuing a career in a field that is notoriously hostile to doing both: international aid. But more than that, today's guest has written a book examining the state of parents in the aid sector through extensive interviews and academic research, and how the industry can change to be more supportive. Merit Hietanen is a humanitarian and development expert and the author of The Humanitarian Parent. She's worked for places like UNRWA, UN Women, and the International Rescue Committee in Gaza, Jordan, cross-border Syria, Cameroon, and Myanmar. Her areas of expertise include women's protection, gender equality, and gender-based violence. So she really knows what she's talking about. She's also a fellow Oxonian and is the vice president of the Feminist Association Union in Finland. So you can see why I really wanted to talk to Merit. Let's get into the episode today. Well, I'm really excited that we're talking today.
Me too. Lovely to be here.
Could you tell me about yourself in your late 20s? Who were you at the time? How would you describe yourself?
I think in many ways, in my late 20s, I think I really believed in global justice overall. And I think I really went to study this human rights and politics with the idea that I would utilize it and I would become a war correspondent or I would become a journalist. And I think from high school, I had taken that I somewhat knew how to write. So I think that was like an easy decision, was that, okay, a journalist can get into all sorts of things and interested in everything, and you only need to be able to write. And so that's what I wanted to do. And I think that the studies that I ended up taking then just took me more deep into ending up working with the UN and with international organizations. And so the journalism never happened, but I have continued over my life all the time writing something. And that's also, I suppose, what the book is. Part of that is kind of a form of expression for myself. But in my late 20s, I mean, in many ways, I also saw myself as an activist. I still like to see myself as an activist. And I think that that's something where being a humanitarian worker or whatever else I do in my life is a bit of a problem, because you're not allowed to publicly express your opinions and you're not supposed to be active. You're allowed to vote, right? But you're not sort of encouraged to be otherwise an active member of society, really. Although I suppose you can, as long as it's not done publicly, but it's still not very encouraging of that. And I think that that's always been a bit of against of what my thinking.
I was going to say, you know, what you're saying about not being able to publicly talk about how you feel in the activism, I think there are a lot of people who can relate to that, who do some sort of public service. I found myself internally nodding along because I used to work for the US federal government for the State Department. And you cannot publicly speak about things that are politically there because you're supposed to be nonpartisan. So that's really hard. How have you managed that throughout your career?
Not very well, I
Yeah.
think. It's
Okay.
like, I think it was in places like when I was working in Gaza, for example, I think it was easier because then you feel like you express yourself through the work. Like you're just responding all the time and you wouldn't have time for that anyway. And you can put your full like time into doing sort of useful things. I think it's much harder when it comes to roles where you're like throwing around papers in an office somewhere and, for example, monitoring impact of other programming or something. I think then it becomes much harder to do if you can't have a voice or can't use your voice. And I think especially people working in the humanitarian sector, but I wouldn't be surprised if also in the State Department or anybody working in different public service jobs actually have felt strongly about different things that are happening in society and would like to impact that. I do often wonder, especially in times of turmoil, how many people's voices have been shut down because of this, or like if you think of humanitarian sector, you have like 200,000 people who can't say what they think, for example, publicly about different issues in the world. I think it's hard, very much. So I think the good thing is once in a while I've been working as a consultant and then I don't have staff rules that are restricting me. I don't think it's just for these sectors, right? Companies have their own restrictions too. So I think it's the realities that come with working with different entities.
It's true. It's though I think it's less than, say, foreign ministry type work or humanitarian work where it becomes your whole life, especially if you are in another country doing it. From what I understand from my former colleagues who were overseas, it's just the embassy becomes your whole life and your world. And of course, there are all the security concerns and things like that. And so I think it's a lot harder to separate oneself from that than a company.
Yeah, I would think so. I think it certainly can be harder for others. I try to generally ground myself in the thinking that when, for example, I've been really angry, let's say about like the Middle East situation or something else, that it's a million times harder for the local colleagues who are also similarly being told that they can't comment on things. So I think in some senses you should always have a perspective as well on your own situation somehow.
So to get to the book and like the big main reason why I wanted to talk today, I wanted to talk to you today because the main question that I got from someone I know who's in their late 20s of how is it possible to have a career and a family? Your book got my attention because I haven't seen something like this before, and I think it's extraordinary, but also I was about to call it a job, but it's more than a job of being in the humanitarian sector, and it is not an easy job. So, when did you realize that your desire to be a mother might conflict with this calling that you had to be in the humanitarian sector and in your work?
I think the moment I informed of pregnancy, for example, to especially some senior colleagues or senior men in the humanitarian sector, who I think had high hopes for me also. Like I think it was a bit of, for some people, a bit of a mentorship role, and I think they were disappointed. Of course, it's not true with everyone, but I think those experiences are there for sure. And of course, they knew something I didn't know. They knew what the restrictions would be and how it would affect the career trajectory. And I think I wanted to believe at that point still that I can do it easily. Because of course there were loads of mothers in the sector. But I think then you come to recognize how limited their roles or what they can do is. And I think when you yourself have had really interesting roles in many humanitarian contexts, somehow at that point it felt like, oh, I'm ready to also give that up, and that then this is the next part of life. But the other jobs are much less interesting, I can tell you that. And of course, there's like a number of locations which you just simply can't apply for anymore. And the work reduces so drastically because staff that work internationally generally are not allowed to bring their families along to a lot of humanitarian contexts. So for me, that limitation was of course there, but also What also happened to me is when I was pregnant with my second child was that at the same time I was working for Syria, cross-border Syria, but from Jordan at the time. And what happened, you may recall, it was 2017, 18, 19 there, where we were working in south of Syria, and the government of Syria, Assad at the time, took over the south, and that basically meant we lost access to all our programming in south of Syria, and which is very normal in the humanitarian world. I mean, things like that happen, but it also meant we simply lost anything to do because we couldn't anymore go to our jobs. And so a lot of the staff got sacked, and I got sacked, and which was normal, but I was 8 months pregnant at the time. So that obviously made life a little bit challenging at the time. I mean, I was fine. I found other work in time, but I think that certainly made me think about this sector a lot, which really relies on kind of project-based staff that do short-term missions, and that it has to be flexible to the context because they change a lot. And of course, like at the same time of feeling really bad about myself and my situation, I was really aware that you had all these Syrian staff who had been let go at the same time, and they were fleeing war, they were fleeing a government, they were considered terrorists for having worked for an international organization, and no one cared or asked if they were pregnant. So I think also there's this constant, I don't know, paradox about your feelings about recognizing that this is not great for labor rights, this is not great for a woman who's pregnant, this is not how it should go, but can you fight for your rights when you know that so many others' situation is actually the people who you should be fighting for rather than your own rights? And I think that's the kind of the dissonance that you're having all the time in the work.
And you talk about that a lot in the book, of keeping in mind of the different conditions for the local staff versus your position. It doesn't make either one any less valid. And I think it kind of brings me back to a point that you made in the book, and that you raised a bit now, of these positions that you can get after having a child become less interesting. And if women are shut out of these positions, we lose something really important. You said yourself also of, you looked at things differently after having a child versus before when you were working on programs for women and children.
For sure. No, I think that's completely right. I think there's, of course, like a larger framework that I'm talking about in terms of there's a whole conversation going around in the humanitarian sector about decolonization and being more local and having less of jet setter international staff going around the world. And I'm just very mindful of this kind of white savior and not wanting to be part of the problem. But at the same time, the sector is not going to change that fast. Like, the reality is that we're still part of it, or there's many others who are part of it. And removing the women is not like the answer of that. I'm not also for not having any international staff anywhere. I think there is positives to sharing global best practices and having different views on things. And also, human rights are not the same all over the world. So if you want to advocate for those, I do think there's a good place for different international staff in different places. But in any case, I think that's completely right. Like, I certainly, after having become a mother, I think I've worked in a lot of these contexts where women's identity is defined by their motherhood. I think we like to think that that's not how women are defined, but in a lot of places, that's how women are defined. Whether they've managed to become mothers or whether they managed to get married, and how many children they have and how well they are mothers. And I think a lot of women are also brought up to think that's the good woman in many ways. And if you don't comprehend the realities of being a mother, I think you can empathize and you can understand and you can read and you can always try to understand different people in different contexts. Of course, you can't be everything and you can't experience everything. But certainly, I think having gone through childbirth myself and having gone through the experience of motherhood myself, I think it gave depth to my understanding of mothers' issues in different situations. Not to try to claim that I would, for example, know what it is to be a mother in Gaza, for example, right now. But it gives another extra layer of somehow understanding what those needs might be and how not having certain services might feel, for example, in those situations.
Exactly. And it's a big part of the human experience So it's important that we have those knowledgeable viewpoints, You asked me something very pertinent when we had our first conversation. You asked me if I had children, and I don't. But I ask this, and this episode to me is really important because we should be talking about it more, of thinking about this is a big decision, and it's not something we can just put off because the answer is just, I don't know, So you have been through it and you are doing it. So how is it possible? How do you make it possible?
I suppose the easy answer to some senses is that you don't really, right?
Okay.
Like, I don't think I try to claim that it's easily possible. I think the whole work life at the moment is not supportive of it in many ways. I mean, it's not been really created for that. But I think that I don't want to call it lucky, because I think this should be normal, but at least I have a partner who does at least 50%, so it should be the norm. But I also live and work at the moment in Finland, where it's completely normal to take a day off when you're sick or when your child is sick, and nobody questions it. And also there's public daycare, which is not free, but it's based on your income progressively. So it's affordable. You have a free public schooling system, you have free universities, you have all of these none of it is free. We pay tremendously in taxes, right? But in a sense of, at least there is decent equity to support kind of parenthood. But I think it's also one of the big problems in our society, in addition to the workplace being so, in many places, at least in the humanitarian system, and I think you can claim this for the US for a big part as well, is not very accepting of bringing the home or the parenthood to the workplace, and your vulnerabilities linked to that. In addition to the workplace not being so welcoming, I think one of the problems is also our very strong individualism, that you don't have the communities anymore so much to support. And I think I happen to have also parents who support. You manage. It's not joyful when the kids are small, but you manage. I think the unfortunate answer when I was working abroad was a big chunk of the reason why it was possible, and working still in kind of demanding roles, was having household staff. And I think that that's also part of this boring privileged answer of why it's possible. But in the humanitarian sector, it's almost expected that if you're an international staff member and you have children, you will have staff. And I think the salaries are also high enough relatively always that it's generally possible. And so that kind of enables for the workplace not to change for the staff or the parent, or to accept that you would need to stay home, for example, when you have a sick child. That just doesn't happen. I was a bit shocked when I came back to work in Finland again. The first week I went to my new job with the Finnish MFA, the first week I was really embarrassed, and I was like, I have a sick child, can't come to work. And my boss laughed and said, like, same happened to me when I started. And I think that that's really not something that you would have done when you were working in a humanitarian sector. Also, you didn't need to do, because you had the nanny to take care of the child when they were sick. And so I think how do you do it? I think the answer is a bit boring. And I think that in some senses, there's been globally, at least in the humanitarian sector, there's been like this situation where the workplace doesn't have to change very much, because you have other ways of dealing with vulnerabilities and needs. Or people leave when they can't do it anymore.
I'm hearing the ways that it does sound like it's possible is essentially supports. So either being in the humanitarian sector, not in your own country, you have staff because of the salaries and the expectations, or at home, it's having family that is supportive, that can take some of the load of taking care of kids, and having a supportive partner as well who does 50-50. This is what I'm hearing of. This is how it's possible.
Those are some of it. I think, of course, it depends on the context so much what is possible. And of course, there is, for example, in my book, I interviewed people who felt that in some situations, for example, the higher you go, the easier it may get. Like for example, in a lot of INGOs, where they felt if you get to country director level, some women felt like it's easier at that point because you don't have your imminent supervisor in the country and you have a deputy who's doing a lot of your legwork, actually. So you get to a certain position where then if you have a nanny, for example, is taking care of your child and you are in control of your own time somehow. There can be kind of these caveats, but there's certainly roles in the sector where that's absolutely not possible. And I think it's hard if you don't climb up there before you have your children. The jobs before the country director, some of them are quite hard to do with children, unless you have somebody staying at home. And I think that's often what a lot of couples do in the humanitarian sector, is that in this kind of overseas work, is that you have the other partner stays at home and the other person works. And I think that's how you manage. And I think that's how we've done it with my partner as well in many occasions. We've been lucky that then they have been quite good at finding work. So you don't feel bitter or angry about being there to support your partner's work only. But that's not, for a lot of people, that's not the case. And it ends up being one person following the other around the world for the rest of their life, pretty much.
And it's tough to be that trailing spouse, especially when you have been equally as educated and equally as invested in doing the work and having a purpose outside of raising a family. And I don't know how we address that, because I certainly saw that overseas, and you see it again in the international community writ large, not just with humanitarian work.
Yeah, and many people divorce, right? And then it becomes even more difficult because then you're suddenly trailing a spouse who you don't even like. And then you're not married to anymore, but because of kids, you end up trailing them anyway. Or then the one person originally whose career has been followed, they lose their international career. I think a lot of people have returned because of that as well. So yeah, there are difficult situations for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get to our listener question so that I don't miss out on it. I think I would be remiss if I didn't do that. So I'm going to play the recording that she sent over so you can hear her voice.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm 27 years old and I live in Brooklyn, New York. My question is, how can a mother find time for herself while working and also being a parent?
Thank you so much for the question, Sam. I mean, of course, I think there's plenty of mothers with good support systems and co-parents who actually do their bit in many ways, or without jobs who are less demanding, in which case I suppose there is less of an issue. But if it's, for example, a single mother with a demanding job or a useless spouse, for example, then I think it's more of a tough one. I have to say I've seen a lot of great peer support systems and networks between, for example, single moms around the world, where people find ways to create families, like their own families of support. So I think one thing would be certainly is to kind of finding ways of being more communal, where you could share the load and share parenting with other people, even if they're not necessarily your spouse always or your partner. But generally, I mean, I do think it's a problem with the system, but I also, if I look in myself as well, I know that I'm sometimes also part of the problem in creating a working culture where I don't take my own time. I think part of a problem with high achievers as well, that we sometimes work when we shouldn't, and we want to show that we're very dedicated with our work. And of course, this is not an issue necessarily for everyone, but even right now, when I'm in a working culture where I certainly wouldn't have to work evenings, or I wouldn't have to work when I'm sick or when my child is sick, I still sometimes do. And I think that every time I make that decision, I'm also part of creating a working culture in a team where other people feel like now they have to do that too, to look good. I've worked also in organizations in Finland where I've had a supervisor who, when I've been there over time, has come to me and said, like, go home now, because it makes them look bad if I work late. And they don't want to have that culture where you have to work late. But that's not even in Finland always the case. You have often supervisors who are quite happy for their team to work late, even though that's not part of what you should be doing. And I think that's where you have to also find your own way of saying no and making those limits all the time. And I'm taking note to myself as well to remind myself all the time of this. But otherwise, I mean, practically, I think what I do I try to make little moments, I suppose, meaningful. It is not like helpful answer, because I think it's generally issues should be around system change than like your own self-help guidebooks, you know. That's not where the real answers lie, but often it's where, while waiting for system change, then you're trying to try to be a bit more selfish with your own time and try to share the load with others a lot. But I think it goes back to very much like finding those networks and people where you could literally, like, I have kid going again for an overnighter at a friend's house, and then the friend will come over to our house and you take your night off with that and you give them another one. So I think you try to find ways of doing that.
I'm sure Sam will appreciate that answer.
I'm not sure she will, because I think their answer is that we should change our whole labor system.
I mean, this is not a bad idea, though. I mean, it's the more often that we say it, right? And we say it as a chorus, and you pointed out in your book, too, of that it is a labor rights issue. You're right. You're right. It's a labor rights issue. And if we frame it that way, it changes the conversation instead of saying it's, oh, well, you've decided to have kids like it's having a pet, which it's not.
But I think that's it. We should demand more from our workplaces. I think that's the thing. And of course, it shouldn't be on the individual to look bad, to shape a culture of a workplace. It should come from higher up, and one should be demanding it from higher up always. But I feel like I can't lecture to people who are working in the American working culture. It's so different from where I am right now.
No, it absolutely is. But it's important to have voices from outside of that working culture. And you've dealt with the working culture because, as you point out, the UN system, especially here in New York at headquarters, is heavily influenced by American working culture. So we can't ignore it. And also, you have experience with it. And I imagine my audience will be heavily American as well as international. And I personally think there's a lot of value in getting all different voices of showing this is how the world is in different places for different women, to answer the questions of women in their late 20s right now of how to deal with the context that we're in.
Yeah, indeed. I think big part of it also is the simple things of, you think simple, but it seems like very difficult. Is like how many workplaces there are where you simply can't take your leaves. You know, of course, in the US, you may not have enough leaves to take in the first place, but even if you have, the culture might not support you taking them. And I think that's also really problematic. I think that you have to fight to be allowed to take your leave. I think it's a shift in a much larger culture than what one individual worker can do. I recommend in many ways for anybody who's wanting to improve labor rights to advance and become big bosses and then start making changes.
There we go. This is for then the older listeners in the audience right now. If you're in that position to make these changes, and yes, for the younger generation to keep working on that. Speaking of changes, and I think getting maybe at the heart of this, why did you decide to write the Humanitarian the Humanitarian Parent?
Well, I was working in the humanitarian sector, and I was quite young when it comes to parenthood and at least the humanitarian work context, in a sense, I think early 30s or late 20s. But I had people left and right of me who were late 30s or early 40s who were immensely stressed about becoming a parent or wanting to become a parent. And some of them were doing IVF across borders in different conflict situations. Some simply couldn't find a partner. And obviously for women, there is a biological clock that is the reality of it. And I think I got quite stressed about that. And I was quite young in a sense of not having to be too worried about it. But I think it pushed me to have my first child. And then I came to this recollection of what it had done to my whole life and my career and the reality of it all. And initially I was interested in wanting to write the stories of mothers who had managed to get to high places in the sector and had managed the system. And so I initially started with interviewing them, and it was meant to be a story about them. But that story became boring very quickly. I mean, those people, they've survived generally because of household staff. That's often the answer. And that's not really an interesting necessary in many ways. And as we were speaking before, the sector is so wide with stories, and there was so many more stories to tell than just of these senior women. And whether it's the local staff, whether it's in different cultures, different people, you have mothers who've left their kids in another country to work in a conflict zone in a different country. You manage having kids by not seeing them. You leave them with your extended family and you go and work elsewhere. So that's one way of surviving, but is that really what we want? And I think that's seemed to be a particularly true story, by the way, from women working internationally who come from the global south, or the global majority, if we want to say. They often leave the kids in boarding schools or extended families, and then they go and work abroad. The stories were much wider, and I think that's so. A book that was meant to be a fast project during my parental leave with my first child mushroomed into a 4-year project of loads of interviews and stories with different people in the sector. And then every person I talked to said to me how I need to talk to someone else. There is a lot of painful stories with different people also, especially everything related to a lot of people who were then in the end ended up without a child as well. There's so many stories of also people who try and feel like they've given all to their sector and then they don't end up having a kid, or those who've had really painful birth stories all over the world, or those who have kids on their own as women in countries where that's illegal and then they try to do it anyway. So I felt like the story was much wider and much more interesting than what I originally started, and that's what happened.
That's great. It's a really interesting book. It is very widely researched, as you say. It's not just interviews, it's also all sorts of other research from other scholars. So it's really quite something. So thank you for creating it. I hope other people will find it interesting and useful.
I hope so too. I know there's also a lot of technical information in it from the humanitarian sector, but I also think it is reality for a lot of people, especially working globally, but I also think in kind of the labor force in general, and the realities of how work-life balance isn't reality for a lot of people, unfortunately, in this world. It's just how it is. And I think each person in the workforce has to take kind of a bit of responsibility of what they bring to the workforce in this situation. Like, of course, I think we can talk about system change and we can talk about the responsibility of senior management, but all of us can advocate for that and do something about that if we want to. And that's helpful, like anybody who takes on part of that, and like recognizing other people's needs in their teams and recognizes needs of people around them that aren't the same as their own, but are relevant to those other colleagues or might be relevant to them one day as well. I think this is really important.
Yeah, because regardless of whether we are parents or want to be parents, we might have other child caring duties or caring duties at some point in our lives with parents, or something might happen to us. So ultimately, it's one big ecosystem. If we had it as a basis, we'd be in a different place. So that's up to everyone to advocate for that, no matter what administration we find ourselves in, no matter who is in charge of the country. It's still something that we need to advocate for. Merit, thank you so much today for this conversation. I think it will be useful to a lot of people in the question of motherhood and a humanitarian career, and I think overall too. So thank you again for coming onto our Pandora's Box. Thank you for listening to this episode of our Pandora's Box. If you liked this one and are looking for more answers about careers, check out the previous episode with Stephanie O'Connell, a money expert and author, about equal pay and what we can do to get it. To check out Merit's book and further readings on the subjects we've talked about today, come to the Our Pandora's Box Substack to continue the conversation and leave us a voice note with your question to shape future episodes. If you liked this episode as well, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss another one. You can get Our Pandora's Box wherever you get your podcasts. Our Pandora's Box is a Pentelic Productions podcast that was created, hosted, produced, and edited by yours truly, Maria Eliades. Thanks again for joining us, and remember to stay hopeful and stay curious. I'll see you soon on the next Our Pandora's Box.